A Daughter of the Samurai. Chapter 4. The Old and the New. I was about 8 years old when I had my first taste of meat. For 12 centuries following the introduction of the Buddhist religion, which forbids the killing of animals, the Japanese people were vegetarians. In late years, however, both belief and custom have changed considerably, and now, though meat is not universally eaten, it can be found in all restaurants and hotels. But when I was a child, it was looked upon with horror and loathing. How well I remember one day when I came home from school and found the entire household wrapped in gloom. I felt a sense of depression as soon as I stepped into the shoe-off entrance and heard my mother in low, solemn tones giving directions to a maid. A group of servants at the end of the hall seemed excited, but they also were talking in hushed voices. Of course, since I had not yet greeted the family, I did not ask any questions, but I had an uneasy feeling that something was wrong, and it was very hard for me to walk calmly and unhurriedly down the long hall to my grandmother's room. "Honourable grandmother, I have returned," I murmured as I sunk to the floor with my usual salutation. She returned my bow with a gentle smile, but she was graver than usual. She and a maid were sitting before the black and gold cabinet of the family shrine. They had a large lacquer tray with rolls of white paper on it, and the maid was pasting paper over the gilded doors of the shrine. Like almost every Japanese home, ours had 2 shrines. In time of sickness or death, the plain wooden Shinto shrine, which honors the sun goddess, the emperor, and the nation, was sealed with white paper to guard it from pollution. But the gilded Buddhist shrine was kept wide open at such a time, for Buddhist gods give comfort to the sorrowing and guide the dead on their heavenward journey. I had never known the gold shrine to be sealed, and besides, this was the very hour for it to be lighted in readiness for the evening meal. That was always the pleasantest part of the day, for after the first helping of our food had been placed on a tiny lacquer table before the shrine, we all seated ourselves at our separate tables and ate, talked, and laughed, feeling that the loving hearts of our ancestors were also with us. But the shrine was closed. What could it mean? I remember that my voice trembled a little as I asked, "Honourable grandmother, is anybody going to die?" I can see how she looked, half amused and half shocked. "Little Etsuko," she said, "you talk too freely, like a boy. A girl should never speak with abrupt unceremony." "Pardon me, honourable grandmother," I persisted anxiously, "but is not the shrine being sealed with the pure paper of protection?" "Yes," she answered with a little sigh, and said nothing more. I did not speak again, but sat watching her bent shoulders as she leaned over, unrolling the paper for the maid. My heart was greatly troubled. Presently she straightened up and turned towards me. "Your honourable father has ordered his household to eat flesh," she said very slowly. "The wise physician who follows the path of the Western barbarians has told him that the flesh of animals will bring strength to his weak body and also will make the children robust and clever like the people of the Western Sea. The ox flesh is to be brought into the house in another hour, and our duty is to protect the holy shrine from pollution." That evening we ate a solemn dinner with meat in our soup, but no friendly spirits were with us, for both shrines were sealed. Grandmother did not join us. She always occupied the seat of honour, and the vacant place looked strange and lonely. That night I asked why she had not come. "I would rather not grow as strong as a Westerner, nor as clever," she answered sadly. "It is more becoming for me to follow the path of our ancestors." My sister and I confided to each other that we liked the taste of meat, but neither of us mentioned this to anyone else, for we both loved grandmother and we knew our disloyalty would sadden her heart. The introduction of foreign food helped greatly to break down the wall of tradition which shut our people away from the world of the West, but sometimes the change was made at great cost. This could not be otherwise, for after the Restoration, many samurai suddenly found themselves not only poor and at the same time separated entirely from the system that had given them support, but also bound as firmly as ever by the code of ethics that for centuries had taught them utter contempt for money. The land was flooded during those first years with business failures, for many of these men were young, ambitious, and eager to experiment with new customs. Such a one was Mr. Toda, a friend and neighbour who often came to shoot on our archery grounds with my father or to take horseback rides with him in the mountains. I liked Mr. Toda very much and could not understand why grandmother seemed to feel that his ideas were too progressive and informal. One day, when he and father were having a game of archery, they stopped to argue about some business plan. I was nearby, trying to ride on the back of my father's big white dog, Shiro. After I had some more severe tumble than usual, Mr. Toda picked me up and stood me very near the grassy bank against which was placed the large round target with its broad rings of black and white. Putting the big bow in front of me, he held my arms while I shot. The arrow struck the target. "Best done," he shouted. "You will make a great warrior, little mistress. You are your father's son, after all." My father laughed as he told the story that night. I felt very proud, but mother looked thoughtful and grandmother shook her head sadly. "Your honourable father trains you in so boy-like a manner," she said, turning to me, "that I fear fate must search long for your unfound husband. No genteel family wants an ungentle bride." And so, even in our pleasant family, there was a continual hidden battle between the old and the new. Mr. Toda was a man of independent thought, and after several vain attempts to adjust himself to new conditions and at the same time retain his dignity, he decided to throw dignity aside and engage in some business that would bring material results. This was just at the beginning of the talk about the strength-giving properties of foreign food. Since Mr. Toda owned a good-sized estate, which at that time nobody could accept even as a gift, he converted it into a grass farm and sent to a faraway coast for some cattle. Then, with a few experienced men as assistants, he once more ventured into the business world, this time as a dairyman and a butcher. The aristocratic family of Mr. Toda did not approve at all of this new occupation, for in the old days only Eta, the outcast class, ever handled bodies from which life had gone. For a while almost everyone looked upon him with a sort of curious horror, but gradually faith in meat as a strengthening food gained ground, and the families who used it on their tables grew steadily in number. So the business prospered. The simpler part of his work, the selling of milk, was also successful, but it also had serious drawbacks. Most of the common people believed that cow's milk would influence the nature of those who drank it, and on this subject they gossiped much. We children heard from servants that Mrs. Toda's newborn baby had a tiny horn in its forehead and that its fingers were clubbed together like cow's hooves. These tales were not true, of course, but fear has a strong influence on our lives for happiness or misery, and in the Toda household there was a real and desperate anxiety about many trifling things. The majority of intellectual men of that day, though broad thinkers themselves, allowed the women of their families to remain narrow and ignorant, and so it was that the constant friction between the old and new ideas ended finally in a tragedy. The proud old grandmother of the Toda house, feeling keenly what in her eyes was a disgrace to the family name, chose the only way to right a wrong that a helpless Japanese knows: sacrifice. If one must die for a principle, it is not hard to find a way. So one day the grandmother was laid to rest with the ancestors whose honour she had died to uphold. Mr. Todder was an unflinching man who honestly believed that he was right in carrying out his progressive ideas, but to his mother's silent protest he yielded. He sold his business to a wealthy fish dealer who steadily became wealthier, for the use of meat and milk constantly increased. The spacious grounds where Mr. Todder's cattle had leisurely browsed were left vacant a long time. We children, on our way home from school, used to peep fearfully through the cracks in the blackboard fence and talk in whispers as we gazed at the desolate land covered with coarse grass and tall weeds. We always, in some way, associated that lonely place with the wandering soul of Mrs. Todder, who by going on the unknown journey had accomplished what here she was helpless to do. One day my father came home and told us that Mr. Todder was now guard to a farmer landlord in an adjacent province. His good fortune was due to the fact that for several years after the Restoration, the new government had much trouble in handling its numerous previously separated governed provinces, and there was much lawlessness everywhere. To the landlord of many small farms, the Restoration was not the tragedy it was to the samurai, for Etsuko was famous for its abundant rice crops, and farmer storehouses were often filled with treasure. But it was a common thing for desperate robbers to raid these storehouses and sometimes even to murder the owners. Wealthy farmers had to be guarded, and since the restrictions of feudal days, which had rigidly regulated the style of living of the various classes, no longer existed, those farmers could enjoy the riches without interference from the government, and it became the fashion for them to hire ex-samurai, once their superiors, as guards, partly on account of the dignity of their former station, which everyone of less honourable rank respected, and partly because of their skilled military training. The samurai were well fitted for this duty. In his new business, Mr. Todder was treated as a sort of honourable policeman guest. He received a good salary, always formally presented, folded in white paper and labelled an appreciation tribute. Of course, this position could not be permanent, for government authority gradually penetrated even our remote district and made the farmers safe. We next heard that Mr. Todder had become a teacher in a test school of the newly organised public school system. His associate teachers were mostly young men, proud to be called progressive and affecting a lofty disdain for the old culture of Japan. The old samurai was sadly out of place, but being of philosophical bent and not without a sense of humour, he got along very well until the Department of Education made a rule that no one should be accepted as a teacher unless he had a normal school diploma. To go through the required schooling and to be examined by those whom he considered only conceited youths of shallow brain would have been too humiliating to a man of Mr. Todder's age, learning, and culture. He refused and turned his attention to one of his most elegant accomplishments, penmanship. He made beautiful ideographs for the trademarks so frequently seen on the curtains that hang from the eaves of Japanese shops. He also copied Chinese poems for folding screens and roll pictures, and even wrote inscriptions for the banners of Shinto shrines. Changes came to our family which separated us from the Todders, and it was several years before I learned that they had moved to Tokyo. Mr. Todder, trusting with brave confidence that the new capital, with its advanced ideas, would treat him fairly. But, after all, he was a gentleman of feudal days, and the capital was overflowing with wild enthusiasm for everything new and supreme contempt for everything old. There was nowhere a place for him. One day, years after, while I was a schoolgirl in Tokyo, I was passing through a crowded street when my eyes were caught by a beautifully written sign, Instructor in the Cultural Game of Go. Between the strips of the lattice door, I saw Mr. Totter sitting very straight with samurai dignity, teaching a Go, a sort of chess, to a number of new rich tradesmen. They were men who had retired, as our older people do, leaving their business to their sons or heirs and devoting their time to practice in Go, tea ceremony, or other cultural occupation. Mr. Toda looked aged and poor, but he still had his undaunted air and half-humorous smile. Had I been a man, I should have gone in, but for a young girl to intrude on his game would have been too rude, so I passed on. Once more did I see him a few years later. Early one morning, when I was waiting for a horse car on a corner near an office building, there passed an old man who had the slight droop of the left shoulder that always marks the man who once wore two swords. He went into the building, in a moment reappearing in the cap and coat of a uniform and taking his stand at the door, opened and closed it for the people passing in and out. It was Mr. Toda. A number of supercilious young clerks in smart European dress pushed hastily by without even a nod of thanks. It was the new foreign way assumed by so-called progressive youths. It is well for the world to advance, but I could not help thinking how, less than a generation before, the fathers of these same youths would have had to bow with their foreheads to the ground when Mr. Totter, sitting erect on his horse, galloped by. The door swung to and fro, and he stood with his head held high, and on his lips the same half-humorous smile. Brave, unconquered Mr. Totter. He represented thousands of men of the past who, having nothing to offer the new world except the wonderful but unwanted culture of the old, accepted with calm dignity the fate of failure. But they were all heroes. Chapter 5. Falling Leaves. The day before Nagaoka's last castle-sinking celebration, Kin took me to walk amongst the edge of the old castle moat. Years before, part of it had been levelled up and was now occupied by neat little rice farms, but most of it was still on marshy waste that was gradually being filled with rubbish from the town. In one place, an angle of the wall projected out pretty far, forming a protected pond where was clustered a crowded mass of velvety lotus leaves. Kin said that the water of the moat used to be very deep and as clear as a mirror, and that here and there were large patches of lotus leaves, which, in the blooming season, looked like unevenly woven brocade with a raised pattern of white and pink blossoms. What did the castle look like, Kin? I want to hear again, I said, looking across the dikes to the ruined walls and piles of heaped-up stones on the top of the hills. Like all castles, Etsuko-sama, she replied, except that this was ours. It was not often that Kin's gay spirits were sobered, but she stood gazing gravely across the ruins, saying nothing more. I turned my face towards the hill and closed my eyes, trying to see in my mind the picture so often painted for me by the loyal lips of Jia or Ishi. A great square mass of stone and plaster with narrow, white-barred windows and tiers of curving roofs artistically zigzagging over each other in such a manner that an object thrown from any corner would find an unobstructed path to the ground, and high above the deep eaves and many pointed roofs, on each end of a curving roof ridge, a bronze fish with uplifted tail shining rich and dark in the sunshine. Below, at the base of the pine-topped dikes, slept in dark quietude the waters of the moat, called the Bottomless by simple-hearted people whose clear waters reflected the six-sided stones of the tortoise-back wall. Come, Etsuko-sama, we must go. I opened my eyes with a jerk. Nothing of the picture was there except the dikes that once formed a protection from flying arrows and shooting spears, and now were only hilly, peaceful vegetable gardens. "All of this ground beyond," said Kin, with a wide sweep of her hand as we started towards home, "was once covered with beautiful gardens of noble retainers whose mansions were gathered about the outer wall of the castle. Now all that beauty is crushed into hundreds of plain little farms, and some of them, like ours, are ploughed by the unused hands of vassals the ancient glorious." Kin was quiet all the way home, and I walked soberly by her side with my bright anticipations for morrow's celebration somewhat dampened. Castle sinking is a term used in Japanese literature to describe the sublime desolation of the useless castle of a conquered people. The new government was both wise and generous in its endeavour to help its subjects adjust themselves to the puzzling situation which confronted them at the close of the war. But Nagaoka people were slow to forget. Many still believed that to have dragged the god-descended emperor from his place of holiness and peace only to plunge him into a material world of sordid duties was sacrilege, and that the failure of the shogun power to march steadily on its rightful way was a sorrowful thing for Japan. I was many years younger than the time of the Restoration, but its memories were with me all through my childhood, for I was born not so long after those years of desolation and bitterness, but that the everyday talk of the town was of the awful days that had left so many homes without a master. In my babyhood, I heard war songs as frequently as lullabies, and half of my childhood stories were tales of heroes on the battlefield. From the gateway of my home could be seen the ruined walls and half-filled moat of the castle. Our go-downs were filled to the roof with weapons and belongings of my father's retainers, and I scarcely ever went onto the street that I did not meet some old person who, as I passed, would stand humbly aside, bowing and bowing with respect and tearful murmurings of glories of the past. Ah me! Death had stepped many times between the strain of those days and the hesitating progress of my childhood's time, and yet the old spirit of dutiful loyalty to the overlord was not yet quenched. May 7, 1869, was the day on which all power was removed from Nagaoka Castle by the new government, and after the bitterness of the first few years had passed, the anniversary of that day was always observed by the samurai families of the town. To the newcomers and to the tradespeople, the celebration was only an interesting episode, but to those who took part it was tribute to the dying spirit of chivalry. The morning after my walk with Kin by the castle moat, I wakened with an excited feeling that something was going to happen, and indeed it was a day of busy happenings. For breakfast, everybody ate black rice. Rice husked but not whitened, such as was used by soldiers during the haste of battle marches, and in the afternoon a sham battle was held on Yukaza Plain, back of the shrine dedicated to the Nagaoki daimyos. What a gay assemblage there was that day! Most of the aristocracy were poor and much of their valuable armour had been disposed of, but everybody had retained some, and each one appeared in what he had. I can even now see the procession as it started, with my father as leader. He sat very straight on his horse, and, to my childish eyes, looked very grand in his cloth garment with close wrist sleeves and bloomer-like skirt, over which rattled and clanged the lacquer-scaled breastplate with its cross-stitching of silk cord and its great gold crest. Of course, his own horse was gone, as well as its elaborate trappings, but Mother's ingenuity had decorated a plain harness with cords and tassels twisted from strips of silk, thus transforming a tenant's farm horse into somewhat the appearance of a war steed, and in place of the swords Father was no longer allowed to carry, he wore 2 sharpened bamboos stuck through his sash, A great crowd of people gathered by the stone bridge at the end of town to see the little army start out. The spectators had clothed themselves as far as they could in ancient dress, and as they waited, the men all sitting with crossed legs in warrior fashion, they made a courageous-looking company. Then the drum sounded, and my father raised his saihai, a stick with dangling papers, which his ancestors had carried to guide their followers, and rode away, followed by a long train of men in armour, as for war. They crossed the fields, climbed the mountains, and after each warrior had made salutation at the temple, they gathered on the plain for the battle, following it with an exhibition in archery, fencing, spear throwing, and athletic sports of various kinds. Our men servants went to Yukazan Plain to watch the sports, but the women were busy all day preparing for the homecoming. Straw mats were spread on the grass, and many fires were kindled in the garden, over which, tied to a tripod of strong branches, swung large iron kettles holding game seasoned with miso, which, with bran rice, forms the food of soldiers in camp. About twilight, the little army came riding back. We children, dressed in our best attire, ran out to the big gateway and waited between the two tall lantern stands with welcoming lights. When Father saw us, he opened his iron war fan and swung it back and forth as one would wave a handkerchief in greeting, and we bowed and bowed in reply. Your honourable father looks today as he used to look in the prosperous time, said Mother half sadly, and I am thankful that you, his daughter, have seen him so. The men piled their heavy regalia in a corner of the garden and sat around the kettles, eating and laughing with freedom of camp life. Father did not change his clothes, except to throw back his war hat, where it hung by its silk cord, encasing him front and back in two inagaki crests. Thus boldly identifying myself to both friends and enemies, he said, laughing. Then, sitting on a high garden stone, he told war stories to us children as we crowded close to each other on a straw mat before him. That was our last celebration in memory of the castle sinking of Nagaoka. On the next May the 7th, the plain was flooded from a drenching downpour, and the year following, Father was in ill health. The men did not care for the sports without their old lord as leader, so the celebration was postponed to a day that never came. Father never entirely recovered from the effects of the hard years of restoration. Each one, as it passed, left him looking less like the sturdy, ambitious youth, for he was only 30 at that time, who had held the reins of excited Nagaoka during those desperate days, but his brave, cheerful spirit remained unchanged, even though the first erratic years of Japan's struggle to gain a foothold in the New World, when people were recklessly throwing off the old and madly reaching out for the new. Father had gone on his way, calm and unexcited. He held, with the most progressive men of his day, a strong belief in the ultimate success of Japan's future, but, and in this he received little sympathy, he also retained a deep reverence for the past. Father, however, was much liked, and he generally could turn aside undesirable comments or lengthy arguments by the aid of a keen sense of humour which had a way of breaking through his stateliness and dignity like a gleam of unexpected sunshine, and so, without title or power, he held, as of old, his place as a leader. One autumn day, Father's physician, who was a very progressive man and as much a friend as physician, suggested that Father should go to Tokyo and consult some doctors of a new hospital renowned for its successful use of Western methods. Father decided to go, and of course he took Gia with him. With Father and Gia both gone, I was desolate. I still feel the heart pull of those lonely days. Sister was preparing for her marriage, which was to take place in the fall, and her time was taken up with many things. I don't know what I should have done, but for my good Shiro, who was equally lonely with me. Shiro really belonged to me, but of course I never called him mine, for it was considered rough and unladylike for a girl to own a dog. But I was allowed to play with him, and every day, as soon as my lessons were over, we would wander around together. One day we'd visited the archery ground and were on the long walk where Father liked to trudge up and down for exercise, when suddenly Shiro galloped away from me towards a little house just within the gateway where Gia lived alone. Gia's wife had died before I could remember, but he was a capable housekeeper, and any afternoon during the summer that I might go to his neat porch, I would find a square lacquer box holding the most delicious things that a little girl could possibly want to eat between meals. A sweet potato baked in ashes and sprinkled with salt, or some big brown chestnuts baked until their jackets had burst, disclosing the creamy richness of the dainty that was waiting for my fingers. I hurried after Shiro and found him pushed close against the porch, his tail wagging and his nose eagerly sniffing in the corner where the lacquer box used to stand. "Oh, no, Shiro," I mournfully said. "The lacquer box is gone. Gia is gone. Everybody is gone." I sat down on the edge of the porch and Shiro snuggled his nose into my long sleeve. We were two as disconsolate creatures as could be found, and I buried my hand in his rough white fur. I had to struggle hard to remember that a samurai's daughter does not cry. Suddenly I recalled the saying, "To unreasonably relax is cowardice." I bounded up. I talked to Shiro. I played with him. I even ran races with him in the garden. When at last I returned to the house, I had reason to suspect that the family felt disapproval of my wild conduct, but because I was all dearness to my father, I escaped reproof for his sake. Everyone had a tender heart in those days, for the heaviness of dread was upon us all. One day Shiro felt sick and would eat nothing I put in his bowl. I had a childish feeling that if he would eat, he would get well, but that day happened to be the death anniversary of an ancestor and was therefore a day of fasting. We had only vegetables for dinner, so there were no good scraps for Shiro. As always, when in trouble, I went to Ishi. She knew we ought not to handle fish on a fast day, but she pitied my anxiety and smuggled me some fish bones from somewhere. I took them to a distant part of the garden and crushed them between two flat stones. Then I mixed them with bean soup from the kitchen and took them to the kindling shed where Shiro was lying on his straw mat. Poor Shiro looked grateful, but he would not get up, and thinking that perhaps he was cold, I ran to my room and bought my crepe cushion to cover him. When this became known to my grandmother, she sent for me to come to her room. The moment I lifted my face after bowing, I knew this was not one of the times when I was to be entertained with sweet bean cake. "Little Etsuko," she said. She always called me Etsuko when she spoke sternly. "I must speak to you of something very important. I am told you wrapped Shiro with your silk cushion." Startled at her tone, I meekly bowed. "Do you not know," she went on, "that you are guilty of the utmost unkindness to Shiro when you do inappropriate things for him?" I must have looked shocked and puzzled, for she spoke very gently after that, explaining that since white dogs belong to the order next lower than that of human beings, my kindness might postpone for another lifetime Shiro's being born in human shape. According to transmigration belief, the boundary line between the orders of creation must be strictly maintained. If we place an animal above its proper position, we may prevent its advance in the next incarnation. Every devout Buddhist is absolutely submissive to fate, for he is taught that hardship in his present life is either the atonement for sins committed in the last existence, or the education necessary to prepare him for a higher place than the life to come. This belief has held Japan's labouring class in cheerful resignation through ages of hardship, but it also has taught us to look with such indifference upon the sufferings of creatures below us in the order of creation that we have become, as a nation, almost sympathy blind. As quickly as possible to be polite, I thanked my grandmother and hurried to beg Shiro's pardon. I found him covered very comfortably with a matting of soft rice straw suitable to his station. Out in the garden, 2 servants were engaged in burning the crepe cushion. Their faces were very grave. Poor Shiro. He had the best care we could give him, but the next morning his body was asleep under the straw matting, and his spirit had passed on to the next state, which I pray was not lower because of my kindly meant mistake. He was buried in the sunniest corner of the garden, beneath a big chestnut tree, where many an autumn morning he and I had happily tossed and caught the fallen brown nuts. It would never have done for Shiro's grave to be publicly marked, but over it my father quietly placed, on his return, a small grey stone in memory of his little girl's most faithful vassal. Alas, before the chestnut burrs were spilling their brown nuts over Shiro's grave, my dear father had been laid to rest in the family burial ground at Chokoji, and one more tablet had been placed in the gilded shrine before which every morning and evening we bowed in love and reverence. End of Part 3. If you are enjoying our audiobooks, please take the time to subscribe, press like, make a comment, or share this audiobook station with other friends who also enjoy listening. Thank you.